My name is Deacon Merritt, CDC disease detective. I mapped the first 30 days of the zombie outbreak from a remote Montana field station while my colleagues turned around me. The infection spreads through bites. The government is hiding something. My maps show patterns that point to this being engineered. I need to find who's responsible before humanity runs out of time. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Deacon Merritt. 3 months ago, I was just another CDC epidemiological intelligence officer, what most people call a disease detective. Now, I'm probably the only person who can explain how and why our world ended. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about survival. It's about uncovering the truth behind this apocalypse, because what happened wasn't natural. Someone engineered this nightmare, and my maps might be the key to finding them. I was stationed at a remote CDC field station in eastern Montana. Most people don't even know these outposts exist. They're scattered across rural America, monitoring potential disease outbreaks before they reach population centers. Our particular station was focused on respiratory pathogens in cattle and wildlife. The facility itself wasn't much to look at, a cluster of reinforced buildings surrounded by security fencing, solar arrays, and satellite uplinks. From the outside, it probably looked like a weather station or research outpost. To the locals, we were just those government scientists who occasionally took blood samples from their livestock. The CDC sent me to this particular station because I had a reputation for seeing patterns others missed. I specialized in outbreak mapping and pathogen tracking. While most disease detectives focused on patient 0, I focused on patient 1,000, predicting how infections would spread across populations. Ironic that I'd be the one to document humanity's downfall. My maps were supposed to prevent pandemics, not chart the end of civilization. Our team was small but efficient. Dr. Eleanor Hanscom served as station director, brilliant virologist, terrible at poker, always wore her Harvard Medical School scarf even in summer. Way and Rodriguez were our technicians, handling the equipment and laboratory work. Patel managed communications and data processing. We'd been working together for 3 months, monitoring livestock diseases across the northwestern region. A routine assignment. We were looking for diseases that might jump from animals to humans. Never once considered it might go the other way around. The station was equipped with everything we needed. Satellite uplinks to CDC headquarters in Atlanta, biological monitoring systems that could detect pathogens in air and water samples, containment facilities for studying infectious materials, and enough supplies to sustain us for 6 months without resupply. October 17, 2024. That was the last normal day. I remember it clearly because of how ordinary it began. The morning air had that crisp Montana autumn feel. I was running routine checks on respiratory patterns in cattle from nearby ranches. Nothing unusual. Rodriguez had made his terrible coffee that we all pretended to enjoy. Hanscom was reviewing our weekly reports for Atlanta. Way was calibrating new sensors. Patel was complaining about the satellite connection dropping during her calls home. The first alert came through just after 9 in the morning. An infectious disease spike in Queens, New York. Initial assessment suggested seasonal flu. I remember joking with Rodriguez about city folk and their poor immune systems. We'd seen similar alerts a dozen times before. Usually nothing came of them. This time was different. Within hours, similar alerts were coming in from Chicago, then Atlanta, then Houston. By noon, our monitors were lighting up like Christmas trees. Atlanta was demanding hourly reports. I'd never seen Dr. Hanscom look scared before, but she was scared that day. The pattern recognition systems were flagging unprecedented spread rates. Whatever this was, it wasn't behaving like any pathogen we'd studied. First emergency protocols were activated across the CDC network. We started receiving data packets from other field stations, hospitals, and research facilities. Everyone was seeing the same thing. Exponential infection rates with unusual symptoms. Patients weren't just getting sick. They were changing. By mid-afternoon, we received the first video footage from hospital emergency rooms in the affected cities. The footage showed patients attacking medical staff, not just agitated, attacking, biting. Hospital security footage timestamp showed first attacks, then the same security guards attacking others 6 hours later. The infection was spreading, through bites just like in those movies nobody took seriously. I noticed something odd in the transmission patterns. Immediately, the infection spread faster in some demographic groups than others, almost like it had been designed with specific targets in mind. I mentioned this to Dr. Hanscom, but she was focused on the immediate crisis, not my theories. In retrospect, I should have pushed harder. That observation was the first clue that this wasn't a natural outbreak. The national emergency broadcast interrupted all communications at approximately 4 p.m. The president's address was brief and clearly scripted by crisis management teams. Shelter in place. Avoid contact with infected individuals. Wait for further instructions from local authorities. Standard protocol for containing an outbreak. But we at the CDC knew better. This was already beyond containment. The final directives from CDC Atlanta came shortly after the broadcast. Protocol Black, complete information lockdown. In 15 years at the CDC, I'd never seen it implemented. It wasn't supposed to exist outside of theoretical scenarios. Protocol Black meant we were to continue monitoring but restrict all outgoing communications to secured CDC channels only. No information was to be shared with the public or other agencies without direct authorization from the director. The last message we received from headquarters was encrypted. Once decoded, it simply read, "Continue monitoring. Document everything. Survival now priority." Then, silence. Little did I know, I had just lived through humanity's last normal day. By this time tomorrow, everything would change. As regular communications broke down, our team implemented quarantine procedures. We sealed the station according to protocol, but it felt different this time. Usually, quarantine is about keeping something in. This time, we were keeping the world out. We watched as news channels went dark one by one, first the local stations, then the national networks. By midnight, only the emergency broadcast system remained, repeating the same instructions on a loop. We gathered in the main monitoring room, watching the infection spread across digital maps of the United States. Population centers were going dark at an alarming rate. Cell networks were overloaded, then failing. Internet connectivity became spotty, then non-existent in affected areas. Power grids began to fail. It was Rodriguez who first pointed out our advantage. "We're in the middle of nowhere," he said. "That buys us time." He was right. Our isolation, normally an inconvenience, had become our greatest asset. The infection was spreading outward from population centers. We had days, maybe a week, before it reached us. Dr. Hanscom immediately set us to work converting our monitoring systems to track the infection's spread in humans rather than livestock. I began analyzing the limited data coming in, trying to make sense of transmission rates and infection vectors. The pattern was unlike anything I'd seen before. Too efficient, too rapid. Natural pathogens don't spread this perfectly. They encounter resistance, mutations that make them less effective. This one seemed to get more efficient with each new host. By day 2, the debate began about our responsibility as CDC officers. Dr. Hanscom insisted we needed to collect samples from infected individuals. "If we don't understand it, we can't fight it," she argued. I countered that if we died trying, no one would be left to share what we learned. The argument grew heated. Patel and Way sided with Hanscom. Rodriguez reluctantly agreed with me. "We should wait for instructions from Atlanta," I insisted. "Atlanta is gone," Hanscom replied. "We're the CDC now." In the end, her rank settled the matter. She began preparations for a sample collection mission. We had detected a small group of infected individuals approaching from the south, former ranch hands from a cattle operation about 10 miles away. Dr. Hanscom and Way would go in biohazard suits with collection kits. The plan was simple: tranquilize one of the infected, collect blood, tissue, and saliva samples, then return to the station. I helped them prepare, still voicing my objections. The suits weren't designed for field work in these conditions. The tranquilizers were calibrated for wildlife, not humans. Too many variables, too many risks. But Hanscom was determined. "This is what we train for, Merritt," she said while checking her equipment. "Patient samples are the key to understanding any outbreak." We watched through binoculars as they approached the first infected on the plains. They moved carefully by the book. Everything was textbook procedure until the moment it wasn't. The infected moved faster than we anticipated, not running but with a terrible purpose. When the first tranquilizer dart hit its target, the sound attracted the others. They swarmed toward Hanscom and Way faster than anyone expected. We lost communication with their headsets soon after. Rodriguez and I watched helplessly through binoculars as they retreated toward the Humvee. They made it to the vehicle, but something happened. The Humvee started, then stalled. We could see movement inside, then nothing. Hours passed with no sign of them returning. Rodriguez and Patel made the decision to attempt a rescue. I objected strongly, showing them my preliminary analysis. The infected were converging on the station faster than we thought. "Give them another hour," I begged. "If they're not back, none of us should go out there." My objections were ignored again. I watched through our surveillance cameras as Rodriguez and Patel took our second vehicle out. They made it to the Humvee. I saw them open the doors. I saw what happened next. Through the magnified view of our security cameras, I watched as both Hanscom and Way attacked them. The infection had already taken hold. Rodriguez managed to get back in their vehicle, but Patel was overwhelmed. The last thing I saw was Rodriguez, driving back toward the station at high speed, 3 infected figures clinging to the vehicle. One of them was Patel. I knew what I had to do. I sealed myself in the secure monitoring center and shut down external access to the facility. Through the internal cameras, I watched Rodriguez stumble inside, already showing signs of infection. Blood stained his clothing, bite marks visible on his neck and arms. They came back changed. Their movements were wrong, jerky, purposeless, until they sensed movement. Then they became terrifyingly focused. I watched through the security feed as they tried to break into the rooms where I'd barricaded myself. Dr. Hanscom's face pressed against the glass of the observation window, her eyes clouded and skin already showing the mottled gray appearance characteristic of the infected. By nightfall of day 3, I was alone in a station surrounded by 4 people who, just hours before, had been my colleagues. Now they were case studies in the very thing we'd been sent to prevent. Something in their behavior bothered me. From a scientific perspective, they seemed to respond to certain stimuli in ways that didn't make evolutionary sense. Almost like they'd been programmed. Natural pathogens modify host behavior to spread themselves, but what I was seeing seemed artificial, designed with specific parameters. I spent that night in darkness, listening to them move through the facility, occasionally throwing themselves against the reinforced door of my sanctuary. I had food, water, and access to the station's monitoring and communication systems. I could survive here for weeks. But to what end? For 3 days, I hardly slept. Every sound could have been them finding a way in. I rationed the emergency food supplies stored in the monitoring center, watching the security feeds as my former colleagues wandered the facility. They seemed most active at night, growing sluggish during daylight hours but never truly resting. I documented their movements, their behaviors. The scientist in me remained active even as the human in me grieved. By day 7, something changed in me. Fear gave way to scientific curiosity. If I was going to die here, I would die understanding what killed me. I had access to the station's entire monitoring network, satellite uplinks, and research databases. I could do more than just survive. I could study this thing, maybe even find a weakness. The secure monitoring center was designed to function independently from the rest of the station. Separate ventilation, power supply, water filtration. Originally intended for containing hazardous materials research, it now contained me. Through the reinforced windows, I could see into the main laboratory. Dr. Hanscom spent hours there each day, moving aimlessly among equipment she once operated with precision and purpose. Her face was now a mask of her former self, skin gray, with black veins spreading like cracks in dried clay. I began by repurposing our satellite monitoring systems. They were designed to track livestock movement patterns to predict disease spread in animal populations. With some coding adjustments, I reprogrammed them to track human movement, or what used to be human. The satellite imagery showed population centers emptying into surrounding areas, then those areas emptying further outward, a ripple effect of infection and migration. Using data from traffic cameras, emergency service reports, and military channels I probably shouldn't have had access to, I created the first crude maps of contamination zones: red for heavily infected areas, yellow for areas under threat, green for areas still reporting organized human activity. With each passing day, the red expanded and the green contracted. I established a routine. Mornings were for data collection and analysis. Afternoons for mapping and refining predictions. Evenings for research into the pathogen itself. Using the security cameras, I studied my infected colleagues closely. I started logging their behaviors, feeding patterns, response to stimuli, pack dynamics. Dr. Hanscom would have approved of my methodology, even as I studied what she had become. They didn't eat or drink as far as I could tell. Whatever drove them, it wasn't hunger in the traditional sense. They reacted violently to sudden movements and loud sounds, but seemed almost dormant when unstimulated. They retained enough motor control to operate simple mechanisms. I watched Rodriguez repeatedly trying the handle on the monitoring center door, but showed no evidence of higher reasoning. Most concerning was their apparent ability to communicate on some basic level. When one detected something of interest, the others would soon converge. No vocalizations, no obvious signals. They just knew, somehow. Another indicator that this pathogen was engineered. Natural diseases don't typically create network communication between hosts. On day 10, I made my first breakthrough. While analyzing infection spread patterns against geographical data, I noticed unusual correlations with water sources. Some communities fell within hours, others held out for days or weeks. The variable wasn't population density or healthcare access, it was water supply systems. Something about certain water treatment chemicals seemed to slow the pathogen's progression. I spent the next day cross-referencing outbreak intensity with local water treatment facility data. Municipalities using higher chlorine concentrations or specific filtration systems showed lower infection rates or slower progression. Communities drawing directly from groundwater sources without extensive treatment fell almost immediately. This wasn't just correlation. It was statistically significant enough to suggest causation. This discovery gave me my first real hope. If certain water treatments affected the pathogen, there might be a way to weaponize that knowledge. Not a cure perhaps, but possibly a way to create safe zones to slow the spread. I began experiments with the station's water supply, adding different concentrations of treatment chemicals to samples and documenting results under the microscope. By day 15, I felt ready to broadcast my findings. The station had emergency communication equipment capable of reaching other government facilities if they were still operational. I set up the transmitter and began sending out regular messages along with digital copies of my contamination maps. To any surviving government or military personnel, this is CDC Officer Deacon Merritt broadcasting from Montana Field Station Echo 7. I have critical information on infection vectors and safe zones. I am transmitting contamination maps and research findings on 30-minute intervals on this frequency. Please acknowledge receipt of transmission. For 2 days, I heard nothing but static. Then on the morning of day 17, I received my first response, a National Guard unit operating out of a repurposed school building in Wyoming. Their transmission was brief, but they confirmed receipt of my maps and reported that my findings about water treatment matched their observations on the ground. Over the next few days, more responses trickled in. A military research facility in North Dakota, a community of survivors at a hydroelectric dam in Idaho, a police station in South Dakota. Each contact added data to my maps, and each map I sent back potentially saved lives. For the first time since the outbreak, I felt purpose returning. I wasn't just surviving, I was fighting back with the only weapon I had: information. I established communication protocols with each outpost, scheduled check-ins, and created a rudimentary network for sharing observations and survival strategies. One of the researchers at the North Dakota facility asked me an odd question during our third communication. Had I noticed any pattern in which demographics were most resistant to infection? I hadn't considered it before, but once I did, the implications were disturbing. The data suggested that certain genetic profiles showed slightly delayed infection rates, not immunity, but resistance. The specific profiles matched distribution, patterns that couldn't be coincidental. Someone had engineered this pathogen to affect different populations at different rates. This revelation pushed me to finally do what I'd been avoiding: analyze blood samples from my infected colleagues. The monitoring center didn't have a full laboratory, but it did have basic equipment for field analysis. I would need to exit my sanctuary to collect samples, which meant confronting my former teammates. I spent a full day planning the excursion. The infected were most sluggish in early afternoon when sunlight flooded the main laboratory through skylights. I would need to be quick, quiet, and prepared to defend myself. I modified a fire extinguisher to temporarily blind and disorient them. I found a tranquilizer gun in the emergency supplies loaded with darts meant for wildlife control. Probably not strong enough to stop one of the infected completely, but might slow them down. When the moment came, I moved quickly. The laboratory door opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Dr. Hanscom and Wei were inside, moving slowly among the equipment. Rodriguez and Patel were nowhere in sight. I didn't allow myself time to hesitate. These weren't my colleagues anymore, they were specimens. I fired tranquilizer darts into both of them, then used the fire extinguisher to create a cloud between us. Moving to the nearest workstation, I used prepared syringes to draw blood samples from both Wei and Hanscom. Wei lunged at me as I finished. His movement slowed, but still dangerous. I narrowly escaped back to the monitoring center, samples in hand. Under the microscope, what I saw defied everything I knew about natural pathogens. The structure was too perfect, too efficient. The virus, if it could be called that, was like nothing in CDC databases. It attacked red blood cells first, using them to replicate and spread throughout the body. But it didn't kill the cells immediately. Instead, it reprogrammed them, turning the body's own systems against it. More disturbing were the markers I found in the viral structure. I'm not a virologist, but every CDC officer gets basic training. What I was seeing matched theoretical bioweapon designs more than natural evolution. This thing was engineered. I spent the next days cross-referencing my findings with historical data on bioweapons research available through CDC archives. There was a classified CDC report from 2018, a threat assessment on theoretical engineered pathogens. What I was seeing matched their worst-case scenario almost exactly. A designer pathogen created to spread rapidly, incapacitate quickly, and leave infrastructure intact. The perfect weapon for clearing territory without destroying its value. Armed with this knowledge, I developed a timeline of potential release sites based on infection spread patterns. If I could identify patient 0, or more likely patients 0 plural, I might trace this back to its source. The data pointed to simultaneous outbreaks in 6 major cities, too perfectly timed to be coincidental. Someone had released this intentionally. As I delved deeper into this theory, my communications with survivor outposts became increasingly sporadic. One by one, they began going silent. Wyoming stopped responding on day 22. The Dam community in Idaho the next day. North Dakota held on until day 25, then nothing but static. With each lost connection, the weight of isolation grew heavier. Whatever safe zones existed were shrinking. The maps on my screens showed less green each day. The red infection zones had merged into one massive stain, covering most of the United States. Only pockets remained, and those were vanishing fast. Meanwhile, the station itself was deteriorating around me. Systems designed for short-term emergency use were failing under continuous operation. The satellite uplink became unreliable, as automated maintenance systems failed. Solar arrays were working at reduced capacity due to dust accumulation with no one to clean them. The backup generators ran dangerously low on fuel. The station was designed for 6-month deployments with regular supply runs. By day 25, I was rationing everything: food, water, electricity. The satellite uplink took priority over heating. I slept in layers of clothing as the Montana nights grew colder. I limited water usage to essential needs only. Food supplies dwindled to emergency rations stored in the monitoring center. For the first time, I seriously considered leaving the relative safety of the station. My maps showed lower infection density to the northwest. If I could reach one of the remaining outposts, combine my research with theirs, we might still find a way to fight this thing. On day 27, I received what would be the final emergency broadcast from what appeared to be military command. The transmission was garbled, but I was able to piece it together. Containment protocols failed at Sites B through F. Site A remains secure. God help us all. Then silence. I spent hours trying to decode what Sites A through F might refer to. Military installations, research facilities. The timing corresponded perfectly with my projected origin points for the initial outbreaks. This wasn't just confirmation that the pandemic was engineered. It suggested a controlled release from multiple sites, followed by containment failures. The main power failed on day 28, plunging the station into darkness except for emergency lighting. The backup generators activated automatically but would only last another 48 hours at most. Critical systems began shutting down to preserve power. The satellite uplink failed completely. Internal temperature dropped to near freezing as heating systems went offline. By flashlight, I studied my maps, looking for patterns, for safe routes. That's when I saw it, a radius of reduced infection around certain facilities. Facilities that shouldn't exist on any public record. Government black sites, research installations built in remote locations, officially designated as weather stations or agricultural research centers, just like ours. The facilities formed a pattern across the country, equidistant, strategic. One was only 80 miles from my position. If I could reach it, I might find answers, or whoever was left of the people responsible. I had started mapping the apocalypse. Now I was mapping something far more sinister, the fingerprints of whoever had caused it. In that moment, my priorities shifted entirely. Survival wasn't enough anymore. Understanding wasn't enough. If what I suspected was true, if this pandemic was deliberately engineered and released, someone needed to be held accountable. More importantly, someone might have a cure or vaccine already developed. With the station failing around me and my former colleagues still wandering the corridors, I began preparations to leave. I would need transportation, weapons, supplies, and most importantly, my research. Everything I'd learned, every map I'd created, needed to come with me. This knowledge might be the only thing of value left in this broken world. The road ahead would be dangerous. 80 miles through infected territory, winter approaching in Montana, limited supplies, and no guarantee what I'd find at the other end. But staying meant certain death when supplies ran out. At least this way, my death might have purpose. I found myself thinking about Dr. Hanscom and the others. Would they have approved of my plan? Probably. Hanscom always said our job wasn't just to track diseases, but to protect people from them. Sometimes that meant taking risks. She took hers and paid the price. Now it was my turn. The difference was I knew what I was up against. I'd mapped it, studied it, understood its patterns. If anyone had a chance of making this journey, it was the disease detective who'd spent 30 days tracking the apocalypse. The next 48 hours were dedicated to meticulous preparation. Each decision could mean the difference between survival and joining the infected. I inventoried everything in the monitoring center and adjacent storage rooms I could access without encountering my former colleagues. Food, water, medical supplies, clothing suitable for Montana's approaching winter. Not enough for comfort, but enough to reach my destination if I moved quickly and avoided unnecessary risks. Transportation was my biggest concern. The station had two vehicles, the Humvee that Hanscom and Way had taken, and the SUV Rodriguez and Patel used for their failed rescue attempt. Both were outside, both potentially damaged, and both surrounded by the infected. I watched through security cameras as my former teammates congregated around the vehicles, as if some residual memory connected them to these objects. Weapons were limited. The tranquilizer gun had only 4 darts remaining. I found a hunting rifle with 20 rounds in the station director's office. Apparently, Dr. Hanscom enjoyed hunting on weekends, something I never knew about her. I'd never fired a conventional weapon before, but I practiced aiming through the observation windows, getting comfortable with its weight and sights. Most crucial was preserving my research. I backed up all data to portable hard drives, printed key maps on the emergency generator's dwindling power, and prepared waterproof containers for my journals and blood samples. If I died on the journey, perhaps someone else would find this information. The truth needed to survive even if I didn't. On the night before departure, I made one final broadcast, not expecting any response. This is CDC Officer Deacon Merritt. I am abandoning Montana Field Station Echo 7 due to critical system failures. I have evidence that the outbreak was engineered and deliberately released. I am proceeding to investigate a suspected government facility approximately 80 miles northwest of my position. If anyone receives this message, the coordinates for both my current location and destination are attached to this transmission. My research data is also attached. Use it wisely. Day 30 dawned clear and cold. Montana autumn. In the normal world, I would have remarked on the beauty. Instead, I calculated sun exposure, visibility to the infected, travel distance before nightfall. The world was no longer something to appreciate, but a series of variables to navigate. I performed one last ritual before leaving, destroying sensitive materials and equipment that couldn't come with me but shouldn't fall into unknown hands. Not that the infected could use them, but if someone else found this place, certain information was too dangerous to leave behind, particularly my notes on which demographics showed resistance to infection. The moment of departure arrived with the sun high enough to make the infected sluggish, but not so late that I'd risk traveling after dark. I put on layers of clothing, loaded a backpack with essentials, secured my research in waterproof containers, and readied my weapons. The security door that had protected me for 30 days opened with a hiss. The air outside, my sanctuary, smelled different, stale with an underlying scent of decay. Moving through the facility required absolute silence. I'd memorized the locations of my former colleagues from the security feeds that morning. Dr. Hanscom was in the main lab. Wei was in the break room. Rodriguez roamed the corridors near the main entrance. Patel had last been seen in the communications room. I encountered Wei first. He stood motionless in the break room doorway, head tilted at an unnatural angle, that gray skin now covered in black veins that seemed to pulse with each labored breath. I raised the tranquilizer gun, aiming for his chest. My finger hesitated on the trigger. This had been a man I worked with, joked with, respected. Now he was a specimen, a vector, a threat. The scientist in me won out. I fired. Wei collapsed, not unconscious but momentarily incapacitated. I stepped over his twitching form, refusing to look at his face. Rodriguez was next, caught in the corridor junction leading to the main entrance. I had no clear path around him. Another dart, another momentary pang of regret. 3 darts left. The main entrance posed its own challenges. The security systems were designed to keep people out, not in. Without main power, the automated doors would need to be manually overridden. The process would make noise, unavoidable noise that would attract any infected nearby. I prepared for the worst, positioning myself to quickly open the doors, move through and close them behind me before the sound attracted attention. The emergency release lever required significant force. Metal scraped against metal as the doors parted. The sound echoed through the facility like a dinner bell. Almost immediately, I heard movement from multiple directions. Dr. Hanscom appeared at the end of the corridor, moving with that terrible, purposeful shamble. From another direction came Patel, her CDC uniform now torn and stained with dried blood. I had seconds, not minutes. I slipped through the doors into the blinding Montana sunlight, pulling them closed behind me. No way to lock them from this side. I'd have to move quickly. The outside world struck me with its openness after 30 days confined in the monitoring center. The sky seemed impossibly vast, the horizon too distant. For a moment, I stood frozen, overwhelmed by space and possibility. Reality intruded almost immediately. The infected ranch hands we'd observed weeks earlier still lingered around the perimeter fence, 8 of them in various states of decay, attracted by the sound of the door. They began moving toward me with increasing speed, that same terrible purpose driving them. The vehicles were parked about 50 yards from the main entrance. The Humvee looked intact, but the SUV had visible damage to its front end and sides. I sprinted for the Humvee, backpack bouncing painfully against my spine with each step. Behind me, the main doors began to open. My former colleagues had figured out how to follow. I reached the Humvee seconds before the first infected ranch. Hand reached the building entrance. The key should have been in the standard location, a lockbox under the front bumper. I fumbled with the combination, hyper-aware of approaching threats from multiple directions. The box opened. Empty. The keys were gone. Precious seconds ticked by as I processed this setback. Of course the keys were gone. Hanscom and Way had driven this vehicle. The keys were likely still in their possession or lost somewhere between, here and where they'd been attacked. I turned to the damaged SUV, my last hope. This time luck was with me. The keys were still in the ignition, the vehicle apparently functional despite its damaged appearance. I yanked open the driver's door and threw my backpack onto the passenger seat. As I climbed in, a hand grabbed my ankle. Patel, faster than the others, had reached me. Her grip was unnaturally strong, fingers digging into my flesh through the layers of clothing. The hunting rifle was slung across my back, inaccessible in my current position. The tranquilizer gun was in my hand. I fired directly into Patel's, face at point-blank range. She released me, staggering backward. I slammed the door shut and turned the key. The engine roared to life, damaged but operational. I put the vehicle in reverse, backing away from the approaching infected. Dr. Hanscom had emerged from the building, her face expressionless yet somehow full of terrible intent. I couldn't look at her as I swung the SUV around, orienting toward the facility's main gate. The gate was designed to keep intruders out, not occupants in. It operated on its own power system and opened automatically when approached from the inside by an authorized vehicle. Accelerated toward it, praying the system still functioned. The gates began to part as I approached. Not fast enough for me to pass through without slowing, but enough that I wouldn't need to stop completely. I navigated through the narrow opening, side mirrors scraping against metal. Then I was out, on the access road leading away from the facility that had been both my prison and sanctuary for 30 days. In the rearview mirror, I watched my former colleagues gather at the gate, unable to follow. Within minutes, they were lost to distance, tiny figures growing smaller until they disappeared altogether. My maps showed a corridor of lower infection density stretching northwest. The infected congregated near water sources and former population centers. I would move between, invisible, just another ghost in a dead world. The coordinates I'd identified were approximately 80 miles away, a 6-hour drive in normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. The first obstacle appeared about 20 minutes into my journey. The access road joined a rural highway that would take me most of the way to my destination. But where they met, a tractor trailer had jackknifed across both lanes. Several cars had crashed into it, creating a tangled barrier of metal. And around this barrier gathered infected, at least a dozen, drawn perhaps by recent survivors attempting the same route. I stopped well back from the scene, considering options. According to my maps, the next viable road that would keep me on course was 15 miles south, a significant detour. Attempting to navigate off-road around the wreckage would be possible, but slow and potentially damaging to the already compromised SUV. More concerning were the infected themselves. Unlike my colleagues, who'd been relatively fresh cases, these showed advanced stages of the disease. Their movements were more erratic, their flesh more decayed. Some were missing limbs or had exposed bone where skin had sloughed away. The virus preserved function but not form. These had been infected for weeks, not days. I opted for caution over speed. The detour would cost me time, but minimized risk. I reversed course and headed south, keeping an eye on my fuel gauge. The SUV had been half full when I started, enough to reach my destination with careful management. but not enough for significant detours or wasted movement. The southern route proved quieter but not empty. Twice I encountered smaller groups of infected, once at an abandoned gas station and once wandering along the highway. Each time I slowed, killed the engine, and waited motionless until they lost interest and moved on. My maps had been accurate about their distribution patterns. They concentrated around places humans would naturally gather: towns, service areas, water sources. By mid-afternoon, I was making good progress despite the detour. According to my calculations, I'd reach the facility coordinates shortly after nightfall. Not ideal but unavoidable given the delays. I'd have to decide then whether to approach immediately or wait for daylight. The sun was low on the horizon when I encountered the military checkpoint. It hadn't been on any of my maps or intel from survivor outposts. A hasty barricade of concrete, barriers and razor wire stretched across the highway. Military vehicles, now abandoned, were positioned at strategic points. No signs of active human presence, but the setup was recent, within the last week based on the condition of equipment. I approached slowly, scanning for movement. Nothing. The checkpoint appeared deserted. As I drew closer, the reason became clear. Bodies in military fatigues lay scattered around the barriers, each showing signs of infection. They'd made their stand here and lost. Navigating through the checkpoint required leaving the vehicle briefly to move some debris. I did so with extreme caution, rifle ready, constantly scanning for movement. Inside one of the military Humvees, I found a partial map with markings that matched my own research. They'd been establishing a perimeter around the very facility I was heading toward. This wasn't coincidence. They knew something about that place, something worth protecting, even as the world fell apart. Back in the SUV, I continued northwest, as the last light faded from the sky. Driving after dark was risky. Headlights would attract the infected from miles around. I switched to running lights only, reducing visibility but also reducing my profile. The road here was straight and empty. Small mercies. The facility coordinates were now less than 20 miles away. According to my research, it should appear on satellite imagery as an agricultural research station similar to my own. The military presence at the checkpoint confirmed my suspicions. This was no ordinary government outpost. As full darkness descended, I was forced to stop. Continuing, with minimal lighting on unfamiliar roads, was too dangerous. I found a defensible position, a small turnout sheltered by trees, invisible from the main road but with clear sight lines in all directions. Here I would rest until first light. I shut off the engine and sat in absolute silence, listening to the night. No distant sirens, no aircraft. Overhead, no rumble of far-off traffic. Just wind in the trees and occasional animal sounds. The world was quieter now, emptier. In some ways, it reminded me of camping trips from childhood, before phones and constant connectivity. Except now, the disconnection was permanent. Sleep came in fits and starts, hand always near the rifle. I dreamed of Dr. Hanscom in her Harvard scarf, explaining complex viral structures with her characteristic enthusiasm. In the dream, her skin was normal, her eyes alive with intelligence rather than vacant with infection. The answer is in the pattern, Merritt, she said. It's always in the pattern. First light found me already awake, reviewing maps and planning the day's approach. The facility should be visible once I crested the next ridge. I allowed myself one protein bar and small sips of water. Rationing had become second nature. The SUV started on the first try, a small victory. As I drove, questions circled in my mind. What would I find at this facility? Survivors? Answers? More infected? If this was indeed connected to the outbreak, would there be evidence? A cure? The architects of apocalypse? I'd come too far to turn back, driven by equal parts scientific curiosity and moral outrage. Someone had done this to the world. Someone had turned Dr. Hanscom and countless others into mindless vectors for an engineered pathogen. Someone would answer for that, even if I was the only one left to ask the questions. The ridge approached, and with it my first glimpse of the facility. What I saw made me stop the vehicle abruptly. Unlike the abandoned checkpoint, this place was active. lights powered by generators, movement inside the perimeter fence, and most surprisingly, a black helicopter on a landing pad, its rotors slowly turning. Someone important had recently arrived or was preparing to depart. I killed the engine and retrieved binoculars from my pack. The facility was similar in design to my station but larger, with additional structures and more sophisticated security measures. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, actual humans not infected. They wore hazmat suits modified with tactical gear, professional, military or paramilitary. Most revealing was what surrounded the facility, a ring of land completely clear of infected. They'd either eliminated all threats in the area or had some method of repelling them. Either possibility suggested resources and capabilities far beyond what any survivor group should possess 30 days into an apocalypse. I was right about this place. It wasn't just another research station, it was connected to the outbreak, perhaps centrally. The helicopter suggested high-level personnel were on site. The guards indicated they were protecting something valuable. The absence of infected proved they had effective countermeasures. My plan to simply approach and investigate now seemed hopelessly naive. This was a secure military installation with active personnel. They would shoot an unknown survivor on site, especially one carrying CDC credentials and evidence of the outbreak's engineered origins. I needed a new strategy. Direct confrontation was suicide. Stealth infiltration unlikely given the open terrain and professional security. That left observation and patience. Learn their patterns, identify vulnerabilities, wait for an opportunity. The same skills I'd used to map the outbreak could map this facility and its operations. I backed the SUV into a concealed position with good sightlines to the facility, settled in, and began documenting everything I observed. Who came and went, patrol patterns, security measures, communication methods. Sooner or later, they would make a mistake or create an opening. And when they did, I would finally learn the truth about who ended the world and why. The disease detective was now hunting a different kind of predator. I spent the next 3 days watching the facility from various vantage points around the perimeter. Observation is second nature to CDC field officers. We're trained to notice patterns, anomalies, connections that others miss. What I observed confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed new concerns I hadn't anticipated. The facility operated with military precision. Guards rotated positions every 2 hours. Supply vehicles arrived at scheduled intervals. The helicopter departed and returned twice, each time carrying different personnel based on their gait and build, though their faces were obscured by protective gear. Most telling was a specialized containment transport that arrived on the second day, the same type used by the CDC for transporting highly infectious materials or subjects. I documented everything in my field journal, sketching the facility layout, noting security patterns, identifying potential access points. My training was in disease tracking, not espionage, but the principles were similar. Find the pattern, identify the vector, trace to the source. On the 4th day, I nearly made a fatal mistake. While relocating to a new observation point, I encountered a patrol outside the facility's perimeter. 2 guards in modified hazmat gear with military-grade weapons. I barely had time to conceal myself in dense underbrush before they passed by. They weren't infected. They were professional security sweeping the area for threats. Like me. Their conversation, muffled through their gear but still audible in the silent landscape, chilled me more than any infected ever could. Control says the new batch is ready for field testing. Sites G through K are prepped for distribution. Already? That was fast. The last version only went live a month ago. That's what happens when you have unlimited test subjects, plenty of data to refine the formula. Still, feels wrong, you know? All those people. Better get used to it. This is just phase 1. Once the infrastructure's gone and population's thinned out, phase 2 starts. That's when the real work begins. They moved on, oblivious to my presence. I remained motionless for nearly an hour afterward, processing what I'd heard. New batch, field testing, sites G through K, phase 1 and phase 2. This wasn't cleanup or containment. This was an ongoing operation. Whatever caused the outbreak, it wasn't finished evolving. It was being refined. By nightfall, I'd returned to my concealed vehicle, mind racing with implications. This wasn't just evidence of the outbreak's engineered origins. This was evidence of continued development. They were improving their weapon using data from the apocalypse they'd created. 30 days of global suffering had been a field test, nothing more. The moral imperative to act grew stronger, but so did the practical challenges. How could one CDC officer with limited resources infiltrate a secure military facility? What could I hope to accomplish alone? Even if I gathered concrete evidence, who remained to hold anyone accountable? That night, I made the difficult decision to attempt access to the facility's data systems remotely. The risk was significant. Any transmission could be detected, but I needed more information before attempting direct infiltration. The station had a satellite communication system with limited reception range. If I could intercept their communications or access their network, I might learn their plans without exposing myself. I set up the equipment from my pack, positioning the portable satellite dish toward the facility. For hours, I monitored frequencies, looking for unsecured communications. Nothing. Their operational security was impeccable. As dawn approached, I was about to abandon the attempt when I detected an anomaly, a brief open connection during what appeared to be a system reboot. In that small window, I managed to download fragments of data. Not enough for a complete picture, but enough to confirm the facility's purpose. Technical specifications for biological agents, distribution models for airborne pathogens, population reduction projections. This wasn't just research, it was deployment planning. Most disturbing was a document fragment referencing genetic targeting parameters. The virus wasn't just engineered to be efficient. It was designed to affect specific genetic profiles differently. Some would turn quickly, others more slowly. Some would be more resistant, providing longer periods for data collection. The implication was clear. They were gathering data on how different demographics responded to the pathogen, refining it for more precise targeting in future releases. The technical language was familiar, too familiar. Some of the methodologies referenced were identical to CDC protocols I'd worked with. This wasn't just government black ops, it involved CDC research, perhaps even personnel. The betrayal cut deep. Had Dr. Hanscom known? Had any of my colleagues been complicit? I shut down the equipment before my signal could be traced. What I'd learned changed everything. This wasn't just about documenting what happened or finding those responsible. It was about stopping what was still happening and what was planned. Phase 2, whatever that entailed, needed to be prevented at all costs. The rational course would have been to retreat, find other survivors, share what I'd learned, and develop a coordinated response. But time was critical, and I couldn't be certain any organized resistance still existed. The facility was preparing new deployments. Sites G through K were already designated. More people would die, or worse, if I didn't act immediately. I spent the day planning a direct approach. The facility's security was formidable but not impenetrable. Their confidence in their isolation meant certain vulnerabilities existed. The containment transport was my best opportunity. It entered through a specialized decontamination chamber separate from the main entrance. If I could access that chamber during a delivery, I might bypass primary security. According to my observations, the transport arrived every third day at approximately the same time. The next arrival would be tomorrow morning. I would have one chance to implement my plan. If I failed, at minimum, I'd be captured. More likely, I'd be killed on site as a security threat. Most terrifying was the possibility of becoming a test subject for their refined pathogens. The night before my infiltration attempt, I organized my research and evidence into a waterproof packet. If I didn't survive, perhaps someone else would find it. The truth needed to outlive me. I included my maps, research notes, blood sample, analysis, and most importantly, the data fragments from the facility's own systems. Together, they told a story that couldn't be dismissed as conspiracy or coincidence. I slept fitfully, dreams filled with Dr. Hanscom's face, sometimes human, sometimes infected, always asking why I hadn't seen the pattern sooner. It's always in the pattern, Merritt, her dream voice repeated. The key is in the water. I woke. With a start just before dawn, those words echoing in my mind. The water. My earlier research had shown correlations between infection rates and water treatment systems. Communities with certain chemical treatments showed slower infection progression. I'd theorized the chemicals affected the pathogen somehow, but what if it wasn't about affecting the pathogen? What if it was about affecting its delivery system? If the pathogen was being distributed through water supplies, that would explain the pattern of outbreaks, the correlation with treatment facilities, the emphasis on water sources in the facilities, data fragments. It wasn't that the treatment chemicals slowed the infection. It was that they interfered with the delivery mechanism. This realization gave me a new perspective on the facility's operations. The containment transport wasn't just bringing in new samples or test subjects. It was likely transporting concentrated pathogen for water supply distribution. Sites G through K weren't just research outposts, they were distribution points. I modified my plan accordingly. Rather than attempting to infiltrate the facility itself, I would focus on the transport. If I could access its contents, I'd have direct evidence of their deployment methods and possibly samples of the refined pathogen. Such evidence would be impossible to dismiss if I could get it to any remaining government or military authorities. The transport arrived exactly on schedule, a heavily armored vehicle with biohazard markings and a military escort. I watched, from concealment, as it approached the facility's specialized entrance. The decontamination process would take approximately 15 minutes based on previous observations, a narrow window for action. As the transport entered the decontamination chamber and the escort vehicles moved to secondary positions, I made my approach. Using the facility's own security patterns against them, I timed my movement between patrol sweeps. The area around the decontamination chamber had minimal personnel during the automated process. Another vulnerability born of overconfidence. I reached the chamber's external access panel undetected. CDC decontamination protocols require emergency, manual override capabilities, a safety feature I was counting on being standardized across facilities. The panel was secured but used the same access codes as my station. Another indication of CDC involvement in this operation. The code worked. The outer door's seal disengaged with a soft hiss. I slipped inside just as the inner chamber began its cycle, finding myself in a narrow space between the transport vehicle and the chamber wall. The air filled with disinfectant mist, standard procedure for eliminating external contamination, before facility entry. I had perhaps 5 minutes before the inner door would open, admitting the transport to the facility proper. In that time, I needed to access the vehicle, document its contents, and extract samples if possible. The transport was sealed, but again, CDC protocols provided the solution. Emergency access panels are standardized across containment vehicles. The panel opened smoothly. Inside, what I found exceeded my worst expectations. Rack upon rack of precisely labeled containers. Not viral samples for research, not test subjects, delivery mechanisms. Water supply treatment additives designed to release the pathogen in controlled doses. Each container designated for specific municipal systems, sites G through K, revealed as cities previously untouched by the outbreak. I quickly photographed everything with the camera from my field kit, then extracted samples from several containers, carefully sealing them in collection vials. I had just completed this when warning lights indicated the decontamination cycle was ending. The inner door would open momentarily, revealing me to facility personnel. I sealed the transport's access panel and pressed myself into the narrow space between the vehicle and chamber wall. When the inner door opened, the transport would proceed forward. I would remain in the chamber as it reset for the exit cycle. If timing and luck were with me, I could escape during that reset before the next decontamination sequence began. The inner door opened. Voices from facility personnel greeted the driver. The transport moved forward slowly, precisely, its bulk barely clearing the chamber dimensions. I remained motionless, hardly breathing as it passed. Then I was alone in the chamber. The inner door still open, voices and activity visible in the receiving bay beyond. This was the most dangerous moment. I had not anticipated the chamber remaining open after the transport's entry. There was no way to reach the external door without crossing the open space visible to facility personnel. Discovery seemed inevitable. Then fortune intervened in the form of an unscheduled helicopter arrival. The sudden noise and activity drew attention away from the decontamination area. Personnel moved to secure the receiving bay for the new arrival. In that moment of distraction, I made my move, not toward the external door, but deeper into the facility. It was counterintuitive, possibly suicidal, but my scientific instinct drove me forward. If I could reach a data terminal, I could download more complete information. The evidence in my possession was damning but limited. I needed comprehensive documentation of their operation, their plans, their personnel. Using the distraction of the helicopter arrival, I moved along the periphery of the receiving bay, adopting the purposeful stride of someone who belonged. My CDC field gear was similar enough to their modified hazmat equipment to pass cursory inspection. As long as no one looked too closely at my face or identification, I might navigate limited areas undetected. I located what appeared to be a research section adjacent to the receiving bay. Unlike the high-security areas deeper in the facility, this area had standard access controls. My CDC credentials might work here if their systems were integrated with standard government databases. They were. My access card opened the laboratory door, granting me entry to a space horrifyingly familiar. Standard CDC research equipment, identical to what we'd used at my station. Workstations with the CDC logo still visible. This wasn't just government black ops using CDC research. This was a CDC operation, or at least had originated as one before being co-opted. I moved quickly to the nearest terminal, inserting a data drive from my kit. The terminal recognized my credentials, granting basic access. Not enough for classified files, but enough to confirm the facility's purpose through unclassified project summaries and logistics reports. Project Firebreak. Population density reduction through controlled pathogen release. Infrastructure preservation protocols. Deployment schedules. Secondary variant development for resistance management. The clinical language masked the monstrous reality. This was genocide masquerading as strategic resource management. The outbreak wasn't an accident or terrorist attack. It was government policy, deliberately implemented with future phases already planned. I downloaded everything I could access, constantly aware that my presence would eventually be discovered. As the data transferred, I examined physical documents on nearby workstations, staff rosters, facility layouts. Most valuable of all, a project organization chart showing command structure. What I saw there stopped me cold. Names I recognized. CDC leadership who had supposedly died in the outbreak. Military officials reported killed in containment efforts. Government executives allegedly lost when Washington fell. They weren't dead. They were here, overseeing an operation that had sacrificed millions of Americans and untold more globally. The data transfer completed just as alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Whether they detected my network access or discovered my entry another way didn't matter. My time was up. I removed the drive, pocketed it alongside my other evidence, and assessed escape options. The laboratory had emergency exits per safety protocols. Unlike the main entries, these would prioritize rapid evacuation over security in an actual emergency. The alarms, while likely responding to my intrusion, had triggered standard emergency protocols. Staff were moving toward designated assembly points, creating confusion I could exploit. I joined the flow of personnel, keeping my head down, moving with purpose. The emergency exit led to a perimeter area away from the main entrance, less heavily, secured under normal conditions. With the alarm situation, security personnel were focused on identifying the breach rather than preventing exit. I made it outside, immediately breaking from the evacuation flow and heading for the perimeter fence. The section nearest the emergency exit had fewer monitoring systems, another standard. Design vulnerability. In the confusion, with resources directed toward the perceived internal threat, external security was momentarily compromised. I cleared the fence just as organized search patterns began forming. Within minutes, they would discover my escape route. I had perhaps a 30-minute head start at most. My vehicle was concealed nearly a mile away. If I could reach it, I might outrun immediate pursuit. The knowledge I carried now went beyond confirming the outbreak's origins. This was evidence of ongoing operations, future attacks, and the survival of supposedly dead government officials. If there was any functioning resistance or legitimate authority remaining, this information could unite them against the true enemy. What had begun as a disease detective mapping the apocalypse had become something else entirely. I was now carrying the evidence that might save what remained of humanity from those who had tried to end it. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but for the first time since the outbreak began, I had clear purpose and direction. I reached my vehicle undetected, started the engine, and headed away from the facility at maximum speed. In the rearview mirror, I could see search parties expanding outward from the perimeter. They would find my observation point soon. They would know what I had learned. They would come after me with everything they had. But I had something they didn't expect. A CDC disease detective's maps of safe corridors through infected territories. Routes they couldn't follow without risking infection themselves. My knowledge of the outbreak's patterns, originally documented to understand it, would now help me escape those who had created it. As I drove, a new determination settled over me. I would find survivors, share what I'd learned, and help organize resistance against not just the infected but those who had engineered their condition. The outbreak was a weapon. Understanding that changed everything about how to fight it. The disease detective had become something else. A witness. A carrier. Of truth. Perhaps even the first soldier in a new kind of war. The evidence secure in my pack represented hope. Not for a cure, perhaps, but for justice. For accountability. For ensuring that if humanity survived, it would know the truth about how it almost ended. And most importantly, for preventing the next phase of an atrocity already beyond comprehension. The first 48 hours after escaping the facility were a frantic blur of constant movement. I abandoned established roads entirely, navigating cross-country using topographical maps and avoiding populated areas. My vehicle's fuel gauge dropped steadily, a problem with no easy solution in a world where gas stations were either abandoned or surrounded by infected. I kept to the forests and backlands of Montana, heading east then south in an erratic pattern designed to confuse pursuit. The facility would have helicopters and likely tracking capabilities. My only advantages were intimate knowledge of infection distribution patterns and the fact that they wouldn't know exactly what evidence I'd acquired. By the third day, fuel concerns forced a difficult decision. I needed to find a relatively secure location with supplies, assess my evidence thoroughly, and develop a longer-term strategy. Continuing to run blindly would only end with me stranded in infected territory or captured by facility forces. My contamination maps showed a small town about 30 miles southeast that had reported lower infection rates before communications failed. If those patterns held, it might offer both relative safety and necessary supplies. With less than a quarter tank remaining, I altered course toward this potential haven. What I found upon arrival was both encouraging and sobering. The town of Clearwater, population 1,200 according to the welcome sign, had established rudimentary defenses. Barricades blocked main roads. Buildings showed signs of occupation, smoke from chimneys, movement behind boarded windows. Most significantly, I saw no immediate evidence of infected within the perimeter. I approached cautiously, stopping well short of the barricades and walking forward with hands visible. Armed figures appeared immediately, rifles trained on me with the steady aim of people who had learned to shoot out of necessity rather than training. "State your business and show you're not infected," a voice called out. A reasonable demand in this new world. "CDC Epidemiological Intelligence Officer Deacon Merritt," I responded, slowly rolling up my sleeves to show unblemished skin. "I have critical information about the outbreak's origins and evidence of future attacks planned." My CDC credentials and unmarked skin got me past the barricades, but trust was a different matter. The town's leadership, a former sheriff, the high school principal, and a retired military officer, questioned me for hours in the repurposed town hall. I shared only portions, of what I knew, gauging their reactions, assessing whether they were potential allies or sympathizers with the facility's objectives. Their responses convinced me they were genuine survivors, untouched by the conspiracy I'd uncovered. They had organized effectively, establishing clean water supplies from local wells, rationing food, creating defense rotations. Most impressively, they'd implemented quarantine protocols that had kept the infection largely at bay when it reached their region. We had a CDC advisory come through before communications went down, the former principal explained. Something about water treatment and avoiding municipal supplies. We switched to well water immediately. Probably saved us. That advisory hadn't come from official channels. Someone within the CDC had sent out warnings against protocol. Another indicator that not everyone in the organization had been complicit in Project Firebreak. By evening, I felt secure enough to share more details and evidence. I connected my data drive to a laptop running on generator power and showed them what I'd found at the facility, the project summaries, the deployment schedules, the command structure with supposedly dead officials. Their reactions shifted from skepticism to horror to cold fury as they processed the implications. The sheriff spoke first after a long silence. "You're telling us our own government did this? Deliberately released this thing that turned half the country into monsters?" "Not our government as we understood it," I clarified. "A faction within it. The command structure shows military and civilian leadership, but not elected officials. This appears to be a coup using the outbreak as cover, eliminating population centers while preserving key infrastructure and resources." "For what purpose?" the retired military officer asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Resource management, population control. The documents reference unsustainable consumption patterns and critical resource depletion thresholds. They viewed this as necessary corrective action rather than mass murder." The implications settled heavily over the room. This wasn't just about surviving the infected anymore. It was about surviving those who had created them, who were planning to release refined versions targeting previously unaffected areas. "Sites G through K," the principal noted, looking at the deployment schedule. "Those are cities that haven't been hit yet. Bozeman, Missoula, Billings, places with strategic resources or infrastructure. And they're scheduled for deployment within the next week," I confirmed. The transport I intercepted was carrying the delivery mechanisms, water treatment additives designed to release the pathogen in controlled doses. The conversation shifted to practical matters. What could one small town do against an operation with military backing, advanced bioweapons, and apparent control of remaining government resources? My first instinct had been to find legitimate military or government authorities to share the evidence with, but the command structure I'd discovered suggested those authorities might no longer exist as we understood them. The retired military officer, Colonel Reeves, proposed an alternative. Before communications failed completely, he'd been in contact with other military units that had gone dark rather than follow certain orders. If those units still existed, they might form the nucleus of resistance against Project Firebreak. "There's a National Guard armory about 70 miles from here," he explained. "Captain Diaz was commanding when everything went sideways. Good woman. Questioned orders that didn't make sense. Last I heard, they'd secured the facility and were helping civilians. If anyone would know how to contact other legitimate military units, it would be her." A plan began to form. We would attempt to reach the armory, share the evidence, and help coordinate a response to the imminent attacks on sites G through K. With legitimate military support, we might be able to warn the targeted cities and disrupt the deployment. Preparations consumed the next day. The town provided a more reliable vehicle with additional fuel. Maps were consulted, routes planned, that would avoid both known infection hotspots and potential facility patrols. Colonel Reeves would accompany me, along with 2 volunteers familiar with the territory we'd be traversing. As we prepared to depart, I found a quiet moment to examine the samples I'd taken from the transport. Using basic field equipment available in the town's medical clinic, I ran preliminary tests on the delivery mechanism. What I found was both fascinating and disturbing from a scientific perspective. The pathogen itself had been modified from the version I'd studied in my infected colleagues. More efficient transmission, more rapid progression, but also more precisely targeted based on genetic markers. The delivery mechanism was equally sophisticated, designed to remain inert until reaching specific human body chemistry, then activating only under particular conditions. Most concerning was what appeared to be a secondary feature I hadn't initially detected. The refined version didn't just cause infection, it tagged survivors with chemical markers that would make them susceptible to a follow-up agent. Even those naturally resistant to the primary pathogen would be vulnerable to this secondary attack. This was clearly what they meant by Phase 2 in their planning documents. I documented my findings and added them to the evidence packet. The scientific precision of the weapon made it all the more monstrous. This wasn't just efficient killing, it was selective extinction, designed to eliminate specific demographic groups while preserving others deemed more valuable or compliant. We departed at dawn, a 4-person team in a modified SUV with supplies for several days. Colonel Reeves navigated while I consulted my infection maps to avoid hotspots. Our companions, brothers named Mark and Jason who had worked as hunting guides before the outbreak, provided local knowledge of terrain and alternate routes. The journey proved more challenging than anticipated. Roads that had been clear on my maps were now blocked by abandoned vehicles or wandering infected. Twice we were forced to detour through difficult terrain, costing precious time and fuel. A bridge we'd counted on had collapsed, requiring a 20-mile reroute through territory with higher infection density. Through careful navigation and occasional necessary encounters with small groups of infected, we made progress. The brothers proved skilled at quiet elimination when needed, a crossbow being their weapon of choice to avoid attracting more infected with gunshots. By midday, we reached the outskirts of the town where the armory was located. Signs of heavy fighting were evident: burned-out military vehicles, impact craters from explosives, buildings damaged by gunfire. Something significant had happened, here, beyond just the outbreak. Colonel Reeves grew tense as we approached the armory itself. "This isn't right," he muttered. "Too quiet. Diaz would have sentries posted, regular patrols." The armory appeared intact but showed no signs of current occupation, no movement on the walls, no vehicles in operation. The main gate stood partially open, a clear security violation for any functioning military unit. We approached with extreme caution, stopping well short and observing through binoculars. No reaction to our presence. No signs of infected either, which was unusual for a location this size. After 30 minutes of observation confirmed no obvious threats, we moved closer, weapons ready. The scenario that greeted us inside the perimeter told a grim story. Bodies in National Guard uniforms lay where they had fallen in defensive positions. Some showed signs of infection, but others had died from gunshot wounds, precise shots to the head or center mass. This hadn't been infected, overrunning defenses. This had been a coordinated military assault. Executed, Colonel Reeves said grimly, examining the nearest bodies. These weren't infected when they died. They were shot by trained marksmen, military or paramilitary. "Facility forces?" I suggested. "Most likely. The timing fits. They'd want to eliminate any military units not under their control before proceeding with the next phase." We searched the armory thoroughly, finding no survivors. In the command center, bullet-riddled bodies surrounded a communication station. Captain Diaz, identified by her nameplate, had died at her post, apparently trying to send a final transmission. The equipment was destroyed beyond repair. Colonel Reeves found her personal tablet, its screen cracked but potentially still functional. If she was contacting other units, the information might be on here, encrypted but potentially accessible. We salvaged what supplies we could: weapons, ammunition, fuel, medical equipment. The armory had been well stocked before the attack. While the others loaded our vehicle, I examined Captain Diaz's tablet, eventually bypassing the damaged screen by connecting it to a functional monitor from the command center. What I found exceeded our best hopes. Captain Diaz had indeed been in contact with other military units that had gone dark, rather than follow suspicious orders. More importantly, She had established communication with a coalition of government officials who had recognized the coup for what it was and escaped the initial purge. They were operating from a secure location, coordinating what resistance they could among legitimate military forces and civilian survivors. The tablet contained coordinates, communication protocols, and authentication codes. If we could reach their location, a repurposed FEMA bunker approximately 200 miles southeast, we would find the legitimate authority we'd been seeking. The evidence from the facility would finally reach those who could use it effectively. Our course now clear, we departed the armory with renewed purpose. The journey would be challenging, 200 miles through increasingly unfamiliar and potentially hostile territory, but the potential reward justified the risk. If successful, we might not only prevent the imminent attacks on sites G through K, but begin the process of reclaiming what remained of our country from those who had betrayed it. As we traveled, I found myself thinking about Dr. Hanscom and my other colleagues. They had been dedicated CDC officers, committed to preventing exactly the kind of catastrophe that had consumed them. Would knowing the truth bring any measure of peace to their memory? That their own organization had been subverted to create what they had died trying to contain? Perhaps not, but exposing that truth might give meaning to their sacrifice. The tablet's map function revealed our best route, avoiding major population centers while utilizing secondary roads likely to remain passable. According to Captain Diaz's notes, several communities along the way had established cooperative relationships with the resistance network. They might provide safe haven and supplies if we could authenticate ourselves using her codes. 2 days into our journey, we encountered the first such community, a small farming collective that had fortified several adjacent properties. Their initial reception was cautious but warmed considerably when we provided Captain Diaz's authentication protocols. They offered shelter for the night, fresh supplies, and crucially, updated intelligence on facility activities in the region. They've been moving through the area in force, their leader informed us. Military vehicles, helicopter support, looking for someone or something specific. Radio chatter mentioned a high-value target with sensitive materials. They were looking for me and the evidence I carried. The facility clearly understood the threat posed by what I'd acquired. This raised the stakes significantly. We weren't just racing to warn sites G through K. We were being actively hunted by forces with military capabilities and intimate knowledge of the territory. While the others rested that night, I conducted further analysis of the pathogen samples using equipment available at the community's medical station. A concerning discovery emerged. The refined version appeared to have adaptive properties beyond what I'd initially observed. It could potentially mutate to overcome resistance factors more rapidly than the original strain. If deployed even, populations with partial natural immunity might succumb more quickly than expected. I documented these findings and prepared a comprehensive briefing for the resistance leadership we hoped to reach. The scientific details of the weapon's design might be crucial in developing countermeasures or treatments for those already exposed. The next morning brought new challenges. A facility patrol had been spotted within 10 miles of our location, moving in a search pattern consistent with tracking someone rather than routine surveillance. We needed to depart immediately, but had to assume the main roads would be watched. Our host suggested an alternative, a network of utility access roads and old logging tracks that paralleled the power line corridors heading southeast. These routes would be difficult for larger military vehicles to navigate but passable in our modified SUV. They were also less likely to be monitored by aerial surveillance due to tree cover. We set out at dawn, following crude maps supplemented by our guide's local knowledge. The terrain was challenging, steep grades, water crossings, fallen trees requiring clearing. Progress was slow but steady, each mile increasing the distance between us and our pursuers. By midday, we estimated we'd covered nearly 30 miles cross-country. The tablet's GPS function confirmed we were still on course for the FEMA bunker, though our circuitous route had added significant distance to the journey. At this pace, we would reach the coordinates in approximately 4 more days, assuming no major obstacles or encounters. As we paused to consult our maps at a high vantage point, Colonel Reeves spotted something concerning through binoculars: smoke on the horizon in the direction we were heading. Significant smoke, consistent with a large-scale fire or multiple smaller ones. "That's near Dixon Creek," Mark observed. "Another community in the network according to Captain Diaz's notes. They were supposed to be our next safe haven." The implication was clear and troubling. If facility forces had identified the resistance network, they might be systematically eliminating supportive communities. Dixon Creek could be under attack, already destroyed or worse, a trap for anyone responding to assist. We faced a difficult decision: alter course to avoid potential danger or investigate, to potentially help survivors and gather intelligence. After brief deliberation, we chose a compromise. We would approach Dixon Creek cautiously, observe from a distance, and make decisions based on what we found. As we drew closer, the scale of destruction became apparent. Dixon Creek hadn't just been attacked. It had been obliterated. Buildings burned, defenses shattered, no signs of survivors visible through binoculars. Most tellingly, no infected wandered. The ruins. This hadn't been an outbreak overwhelming defenses, this had been systematic elimination. "They're cleaning up," Colonel Reeves stated grimly. "Removing any potential allies or support networks for resistance forces. This is standard counterinsurgency. Isolate your enemy before engaging them directly." The implications were clear and urgent. If facility forces were attacking network communities, the FEMA bunker itself might be at risk or already compromised. We needed to warn the resistance leadership immediately. The tablet contained emergency communication protocols, heavily encrypted channels designed to function even in compromised environments. Using components salvaged from the Armory's communication equipment, I constructed a makeshift transmitter capable of sending a simple encoded message to the coordinates. The response came almost immediately. A single acknowledgement followed. By new coordinates approximately 50 miles west of the original location. A fallback position, presumably more secure or less known to facility forces. The message included a request for authentication and summary of our intelligence. I provided Captain Diaz's codes and a brief overview of what we carried: evidence of Project Firebreak, samples of the refined pathogen, and intelligence on imminent deployments against Sites G through K. The response directed us to proceed to the new coordinates with all possible speed, avoiding all communities and known routes regardless of prior safety assessments. With renewed urgency, we altered course toward the new destination. The detour would cost us another day at minimum, but the intelligence we carried would be worthless if we were intercepted before delivery. Every hour increased the risk that facility forces would proceed with their planned deployments against the targeted cities. Night found us making painful progress through difficult terrain. We traveled without lights, navigating by moonlight and GPS, pushing our vehicle and ourselves to the limits of endurance. Dawn brought no respite. We continued moving, stopping only for essential maintenance and brief rest periods. By the afternoon of the 6th day since leaving Clearwater, we approached the new coordinates. The location appeared to be an abandoned mining operation nestled in low mountains, unremarkable from a distance but strategically positioned with excellent natural defenses and multiple escape routes. As we drew closer, camouflaged observation posts became visible. Professional security, not civilian survivors but trained military personnel in unmarked tactical gear. They directed us through a concealed entrance into the mountain itself, where a repurposed mining tunnel led to a sprawling underground complex. Inside, the contrast with the ruined world above was stark. Organized operations, functional equipment, purposeful movement. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a command center. Maps covered walls, communication equipment hummed continuously, and personnel in both military and civilian attire moved with clarity of mission that had become rare in this broken world. We were escorted directly to what appeared to be a briefing room. The individuals waiting there represented what remained of legitimate government and military leadership: a general, 2 intelligence directors, a cabinet undersecretary, and several others whose roles weren't immediately apparent, but whose authority was unquestionable. "Dr. Merritt," the general began without preamble, We've been following your movement since you escaped the Montana facility. Your work mapping the outbreak proved invaluable even before you discovered its origins. Now we need everything you've learned about Project Firebreak immediately. The clock is running. For the next hours, I presented everything. The evidence, from the facility, my analysis of the pathogen samples, the deployment schedules for sites G through K. They listened intently, occasionally conferring in whispers or sending staff to retrieve additional information. When I finished, the general spoke again. You've confirmed what we suspected but couldn't prove. This gives us the authorization we needed to move against the project leadership directly. Unfortunately, we may already be too late to stop the next deployments. They're scheduled to begin within 12 hours. What about warning the targeted cities? I asked. Already underway, but evacuation of entire cities in that time frame is impossible. Our best hope is to neutralize the delivery mechanisms before activation. The Undersecretary added, Dr. Merritt, your expertise regarding the pathogen and its delivery system is unique. We need you to assist our teams in identifying and disabling the deployment devices. Your maps of infection patterns may also help us plan counter-operations with minimal exposure risk to our forces. The request surprised me. I was a disease detective, not a field operative, but I understood the necessity. No one else had my specific knowledge combination, CDC protocols, the facility's operations, and the pathogen's characteristics. I agreed without hesitation. Within hours, I found myself briefing special operations teams preparing to deploy to the targeted cities. My maps and analysis would guide their approach paths through infected territories. My knowledge of the delivery mechanisms would help them identify and neutralize the deployments before activation. As preparations continued around me, I stepped away briefly to conduct one final test I'd been postponing. Using the advanced equipment available in the bunker's laboratory, I analyzed a blood sample, my own. What I found both confirmed suspicions. I'd been harboring and opened new possibilities I hadn't dared consider. My blood contained markers indicating partial immunity to the pathogen, not complete resistance, but significant enough to delay or modify infection progression. More importantly, these markers corresponded to genetic profiles, specifically targeted in the refined version's design. I wasn't unique. I represented a demographic the weapons creators sought to eliminate with particular efficiency in their next deployment. This discovery had implications beyond my personal survival. If certain genetic profiles showed natural resistance factors, those factors could potentially be identified, isolated, and reproduced as treatment protocols. Not a cure, perhaps, but possibly a way to create immunity in those not yet exposed. I brought this finding to the medical team immediately. Their response was cautiously optimistic. With samples of both the original and refined pathogens, along with blood from individuals showing resistance markers, they might develop countermeasures more quickly than previously estimated. As I prepared to join the operation teams deploying to the targeted cities, I reflected on how far I'd come from that isolated CDC field station 30 days earlier. I had begun by mapping the apocalypse as an observer, a recorder of humanity's apparent end. Now I was actively fighting to prevent its continuation, armed with evidence, knowledge, and something I hadn't felt since watching Dr. Hanscom transform, hope. The disease detective had become something else entirely. Not just a witness, but a weapon against those who had weaponized disease itself. The patterns I'd spent my career identifying had led me here, to this moment, to this resistance. Dr. Hanscom had been right all along. The answer was always in the pattern. You just had to know how to read it.